Good evening and welcome to this new episode of Cocktails with a Curator. I'm Xavier Salomon, the Chief Curator at the Frick Collection in New York. Over the past 2 weeks, we traveled with Constable to the English countryside and then with Turner across the Channel to France. This week, I would like to stay very much in France and jump back in time a little bit. As a cocktail this evening, I'm having a French 75. This is a cocktail which was invented in the early 20th century in France. Of course, it's known as a French 75 everywhere in the world, except from France, where it's known as a 75. And supposedly it was invented because they were trying to make a sort of gin and tonic, and running out of tonic, they used champagne instead. So it's basically champagne and gin, with lemon juice, simple syrup, and a little peel of lemon in it. And it was supposed to have the effect on you of a 75 field gun, which were the most powerful guns invented for First World War at that time. So cheers. So we're entering week 10 of lockdown in New York. It's been 9 weeks, and for other people all over the world, it's been even longer than that. So I thought that today we should travel inside somebody's house. And I would like to look at Boucher's Lady on a Daybed, a painting which was acquired by the Frick Collection, not by Henry Clay Frick, but later on by the museum in 1937, just 2 years after the Frick opened to the public in 1935. Now, all of us are spending a lot of time at home, more than ever. I personally don't think I've ever spent this amount of time in my own home in my entire life. And I suspect many of us are spending a lot of that time in bed or on a sofa, and maybe you're even watching this program from your bed or your sofa, or even maybe your daybed. And so I thought this would be a very interesting picture to talk about, because here we are inside a woman's boudoir, probably, inside a Parisian elegant home of the mid-18th century. And Boucher is telling us a lot about the space and a lot about this woman in ways that we may even find surprising today. Now, what she's lying on, this daybed, is actually a sort of combination of a sofa and a bed. It has aspects of both of those elements. And while beds, of course, existed in Europe since the beginning of time, a sofa was a fairly new invention in the 18th century. Sofas were probably brought into Europe in the 17th century. And the words used for those sort of pieces of furniture, the word sofa, the word ottoman, the word divan, in Italian, for example, a sofa is known as a divano, are all words that come from the Arabic world, from the Muslim world. And in fact, most of these pieces of furniture were inspired by looking at the East, looking especially at Ottoman Turkey. So, of course, they always imply images of women in harems. But by the 18th century, in France, in England, all over Europe, sofas are very much part of every fashionable home. And here is a very fashionable lady on her daybed in her own house. Boucher prominently signed and dated this picture on the floor to the right. We see his signature, and it's dated 1743. When we tour around this room, we focus first on this beautiful woman, elegantly dressed, rather provocative in the way she is looking at us out of the picture. But she is surrounded by a series of objects and set against this wallpaper or fabric behind her with this very bold and decorative pattern on yellow. And so let's take a tour of her room. Here are her shoes, her very elegant new fashion shoes that she is displaying in a rather provocative manner again on the bed. But there are also other important elements in this painting. So, for example, to her right is what looks like a watch, but it is in fact probably a combination of a thermometer and a barometer. So a very technical gadget, something, again, very up-to-date and fashionable at the time. There is a little table next to her. There is a book on it and a letter. Maybe she's just finished reading this book. Maybe we don't know what novel or what type of text it is. Maybe she is picking it up. Maybe she's just putting it down. The drawer is open, suggesting that maybe the letter has just come out of that drawer, or maybe it's going into that drawer. And of course, who is the letter from? On the floor, there is her set of tools for probably embroidery. So she's also been working on something like that, probably embroidering this piece of textile. And there is a string, a sort of a thread that then goes all the way down to the floor. There is a screen to the right, and this is an exotic screen. As we will see, it may be Chinese or in any case, a foreign object, which again was fashionable at the time to have in your house. And finally, just above her, there is this little piece of furniture hanging on the wall. This is called an étagère, and it's sort of like a hanging bookshelf, effectively, with a little cupboard below it. But on it, you see a little Chinese figure. And these were little porcelain figures from China that were, again, hugely popular in 18th century France. They were known as magots. And below it, a teapot and cups. And as much as we think today of teapots as normal things in a household, we all have teapots as much as we have sofas. Of course, in the 18th century, these were very exotic objects. Again, porcelain from China was very valuable, and tea, just as much as coffee and chocolate, were very exotic new beverages. And there is another piece of paper on that étagère, which if you look at carefully, you realize that it has Boucher's name on it again. So Boucher is effectively signing this picture twice. So who was Boucher? François Boucher is really the epitome in many ways of 18th century French art. He was born and died in Paris, and he lived effectively across the whole of the 18th century. He was born in 1703 and he died in 1770. He, as a young man, trained first with his father, who was a minor painter, and then with a couple of other painters in Paris. And then in 1723, he won the Prix de Rome. And that was a prize for a good young artist, and it would allow that artist to travel to Rome. But because there were problems with the Academy at that time and a number of other issues, Boucher did not make it to Rome until 5 years later in 1728. And he stayed there for a couple of years, returning to Paris in 1731. In 1734, he joins the Academy, the Royal Academy, and the apex of Boucher's success is finally reached in 1765 when he is appointed Premier Peintre du Roi, the first painter of the king, of Louis XV. So, of course, he becomes the court artist. In 1733, Boucher marries, at that point he's 30, he marries a 17-year-old girl, Marie-Jeanne Bouzeau. And this is really a love match, and the two have a very happy marriage together. They have 3 children, and Madame Boucher survives Boucher for many, many years and dies many years later in their house as still a very celebrated woman. She was also, we know, a great collaborator of her artist husband. So she supposedly modeled for him a number of times. And of course, let's remember that at the time, artists working at the Academy could only be allowed to sketch male nude models. So to have a female model, you either have to have her privately in your home as a studio, or artists use their mistresses, girlfriends, wives. So here is Marie-Jeanne in a portrait by Rosselin, but we have to imagine that she actively worked with her husband. And we know she made miniatures copying some of her husband's paintings, but she also later on signed etchings. So she was a very accomplished artist herself. When this painting was acquired in 1937 by the Frick, it was acquired as a portrait of Madame Boucher. And this has been long in the literature, and still to this day, many people refer to this picture as Madame Boucher. But even though his wife may have sat for this portrait, for this painting, may have been one of the models used for it, it's clearly not meant to be a portrait. This is not a typology that would be used in portraits at the time. It's a small cabinet picture, is more of a genre scene, an everyday scene of life with potentially, as we'll see, erotic overtones. But it's clearly not an official portrait of an artist's wife. And comparing it to the Rosselin we just seen, you can understand how different that would be. As the premier peintre du roi, Boucher became incredibly close to Madame de Pompadour, Louis XV mistress at that time. And Madame de Pompadour became one of the great admirers and patrons of Boucher. And this is to give you a sense of one of her grand portraits, probably the grandest and most beautiful, now in Munich, which shows Madame de Pompadour also reclining on a sofa of some kind. But, and you know, again, you get the letters, you get the little table, you get the book, you get a clock in this case rather than the barometer, thermometer, a big grand mirror. But you can see how different this is from the other painting. Apart from the fact that this shows the top of elegance in terms of interior decorating, the other one shows a somewhat more modest home. But while this is a grand life-size portrait, the other one is very much a cabinet picture. Now, when we think of Boucher, we think of him as the great painter of grand mythological 18th century paint, as these great Rococo inventions. And so just to give you some examples, here are the rising and the setting of the sun, huge canvases, which are now at the Wallace Collection in London. And some of my favorites in America, a series of canvases, mythological canvases, which are now at the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth in Texas. And here I'm showing you Venus and Vulcan on the left, and Juno asking Aeolus to unleash the winds from his cave. Now, mythological paintings would allow an artist like Boucher to represent more directly erotic visions. And so here are some smaller cabinet pictures where this is clearly obvious. This is the beautiful Diana bathing at the Louvre, which clearly is a mythological painting, but at the same time, it's really an excuse to show a beautiful female nude, most likely, absolutely, for obviously a male audience. And this, which is one of the greatest of these pictures that Boucher produces, the Hercules and Omphalie in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. But some other paintings without the mythological subject became absolutely purely erotic depictions. And here is a woman on a sofa. This was identified as one of the mistresses of Louis XV, is known as the blonde odalisque. It exists in two versions, one in Cologne and this one in Munich. But you see here that there is no mythology, there is no narrative. This is simply a private picture showing this beautiful woman in an overtly erotic pose. And this is what male patrons of Boucher loved at that time. Of course, this tradition comes from the Renaissance, and it comes from pictures such as this, the Venus of Urbino by Titian. Of course, this is a Venus, so supposedly, again, a mythological picture. But the odalisques by Boucher very much look back to these earlier models. And here is the second odalisque he paints, the dark-haired odalisque. The blonde is from around early 1750s, 1752. This is from 1745. So this is painted actually 2 years after so-called Madame Boucher at the Frick. And even though we don't think of this today, this has a lot of links, this painting, to exoticism as well, and Turkish fashion. And so the type of sofa, bed she is lying on is actually Turkish in manner and comes from depictions of harems at the time. And her headgear and various other aspects of this painting are particularly exotic. Look, for example, at the porcelain gilt-mounted vase at the bottom left near her pearls and jewels. And we will see that again in a minute. When you compare the blonde or dark-haired odalisque with our painting at the Frick, you clearly understand why people decided this picture was Madame Boucher, and it was a portrait rather than an erotic painting. But in fact, Madame Boucher, the so-called Madame Boucher at the Frick, sits within a tradition of other pictures by Boucher, which are very much similar to this. And also a broader depiction of women on sofas, like this beautiful painting by Lyotard, from the 1750s now at Uffizi, which is probably a portrait of a French aristocratic woman from the time in Turkish outfits on a Turkish sofa in a harem. This is the most directly relevant picture to our painting at the Frick, and it's known as La Toilette, and it is at the Thyssen Museum in Madrid, and it was painted only a year earlier than our painting. It's signed and dated 1742. But when you look at it, you see this elegant woman at her toilette tying her garter, and there is a servant coming and showing her a number of dresses. But as you look at this, you realize that there are actually a lot of objects that should be familiar to you by now. So the screen behind her, the Chinese screen, is probably the same identical one that it is in the Frick picture. On the mantelpiece, you see that gray same vase with the gilt bronze, which is the one that appears in the dark-haired odalisque. And next to the main lady, you also see the teapot and cups that appear in the Frick picture. So many of these things, and including even the wallpaper, the textile wallpaper, are very, very similar. So it is clear that the so-called Madame Boucher at the Frick is in fact a combination of objects that Boucher probably owned himself in his own home. And these pictures, even though they show ladies reclining on a daybed, a woman tying a garter, are clearly erotic in their undertones, and even not so subtly. If you look at this picture, for example, Boucher is always great in terms of witty comments. You realize that what is placed between the woman's open legs is a cat. Enough said, obviously. Boucher loved China, and he owned a number of Chinese objects that he acquired over the years. And my favorite exhibition last year, one of the most interesting exhibitions I've seen in a very long time, was an exhibition in Besançon in France, which focused on the relationship between Boucher and China. And it included a number of objects, Chinese objects, either owned by Boucher or similar to objects we know he owned. And when Boucher died in the 1770s, there was a great sale of his collection. So we know pretty much exactly the type of objects he owned. And so many of the things that appear in these paintings were objects that were owned by the painter. His relationship with China was linked to merchants like Gersaint, who were merchants in exotic goods. And so Boucher designs in the 1740s this greeting card for Gersaint, with, of course, with all the objects that a merchant like Gersaint would have sold, and many of these obviously great exotic objects, Chinese porcelain and shells and things of that kind. In the same year as he's painting the Frick painting, Boucher is also at work on one of his great commissions, which is the design of a set of tapestries for the manufactory of Beauvais of Chinese subjects, the Chinese tapestries of Boucher. And the sketches for them that you see here displayed together with some of the tapestries are actually in Besançon, which is why they did this exhibition last year. And so this was the first time you could see all of the sketches in Besançon with the actual tapestries. And it was a pretty unforgettable experience. Just to give you an example, here is a detail of one of the beautiful small sketches that he does for the tapestries, showing this wonderful Chinese princess. And here is a version of the final tapestry. This exhibition also brought together for the first time our picture on the left with the Toilette from the Thyssen on the right, and a third related picture from the Louvre in the middle. And looking at these three on the same wall was a unique opportunity to be able to compare some of these objects, some of these choices, and understand how clever Boucher is in putting these things together and displaying this erotic and exotic ensemble for the viewer. So I hope you've enjoyed looking at this picture with me from your daybed or your sofa, and I hope you're enjoying your French 75. I will definitely enjoy mine. But let's finish with a quote from the Goncourt brothers, who, writing about Boucher, tell us that for them, Boucher is one of those men who represents the taste of a century, who express, personify, and embody it. So I still think of Boucher as really the quintessential 18th century artist. And I hope that by looking at this picture, you understand how many interesting threads go into making a picture like this. And even though she's not Madame Boucher, we love her still the same. Thank you and see you next week.